Growing up, Jane Eyre was one of my favorite novels, and I think this might be a close second. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Read Good, Draw Bad, where we love to read really good and draw really bad. For today's book, we are reading The Wide Sargasso Sea by John Rhys, which is a prequel to Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It explores the untold story of Bertha Manson, who was the mad woman in the attic, and provides a compelling exploration of themes like race, colonialism, and identity. And just so you know, I am doing a reading challenge where I'm reading the Modern Library's top 100 novels of the 20th century. Today's book is a totally fun entry into the series because it's a throwback to Jane Eyre if you've read it and loved it, but don't remember a thing about it. You'll still really be able to enjoy today's book. First, a TLDR summary. There are four main characters in this book. We have Antoinette Rochester, who is burdened by her mother's mental illness, as well as the marriage which is slowly crumbling under her feet, even though she's a newlywed. She also suffers from the locals in the towns around her because her parents were white slave owners and the people in town obviously were black. She is scorned by the local black, Creole, Jamaican population, and now slavery is supposed to not exist anymore in Jamaica. The second main character is Mr. Edward Rochester, who we know from Jane Eyre, who travels to Jamaica to marry Antoinette. And Mr. Rochester goes to Jamaica to marry Antoinette because he is entranced by not only her beauty, but also by her money. Because her dad left her an enormous sum of money, which was gained through slave labor. Then we have Christophine. I loved Christophine in this book. She's a representative of strength and beauty and not holding to the pressures of social norms while still standing on your own in society. Christophine is the former slave slash servant of Antoinette's family. However, she also fills a role of surrogate mother after Antoinette's mother's mental illness. And the thing that's really interesting is that Christophine represents a kind of strength and social justice that allows her to stand up to both the white and black characters in this book who constantly try and manipulate her for their gain. The last main character of this book, even though he doesn't seem like so important, is Richard Mason. Richard Mason is a stepbrother and the key figure in arranging the marriage to Mr. Rochester. And he also knows that Mr. Rochester is kind of a blockhead, so he's going to get the better end of the deal. Richard Mason represents the English influence in Jamaica and the colonialism that comes with it. He exploits the family wealth for his own benefit and gain while also robbing Antoinette of her freedom. And he is the most important because he is actually the secret villain of this book. This novel is set in 20th century Jamaica and takes us on a journey of the complex and often very sad life of Antoinette Causeway, who later becomes known as Mrs. Rochester, or the first Mrs. Rochester, I guess, in Jane Eyre. You know, the woman he locks in an attic for her whole life. That one. The plot follows the gradual disintegration of Antoinette's identity and freedom, and eventually her mental health. It teases out the tensions between the complex white and black characters, and wow, there are some very complex relationships in this book. And I can say that because this book is so thematic. Even though it's so short, it's just jam-packed with ideas and thoughtfulness about the right way and the wrong way to go about getting married in English society. And that is the plot. The plot is about the marriage between Antoinette and Mr. Rochester. And we follow both of their perspectives throughout the whole book. There is a huge contrast between Antoinette's view, which has her loving her country, being part of the wild wilderness that is expansive and beautiful, and the setting is described in such a way that makes you feel like you're almost there. Whereas when Mr. Rochester's view takes over in half of the book, we see a world that seems strange and he is indifferent to it because it is not the English way of life. And Mr. Rochester sort of holds that view that I think people held back then, that England was the best society in the world and you couldn't do better than wanting to live and be part of England, even though Antoinette throughout the book desperately wants not to leave where she's from. But she gets shipped off on a boat, so like nothing really good happens. The book starts with Antoinette's perspective as a young girl and her not understanding the tensions of slavery and colonialism that are part of her own life because her parents are slave owners. But her mother loses her marbles, her dad dies, and her stepbrother and her husband con her out of the dowry money that is actually hers to control. This book kind of does a one bad turn deserves another bad turn in this book, but I think what you can take from this, instead of thinking of it as a sad book, because I didn't take it that way, I thought of it as more of a thoughtful essay on what's wrong with the current world situation and things that could be done to change it based on social and moral standards that existed at that time. It also helps that all the men in this book are complete pigs. Now, let's talk about the themes a little bit, because like I said, this is a thematic book. Thematic book! And if you know me, I love a thematic book because it just gives me lots to think and ponder about. And we love to ponder. The main theme, or at least I think what the point of this book is, what is the effect of race, gender, and class on 19th century Britain and its colonies? And you get that answer through the main character's complete misfortune and inability to subvert the roles that other people have laid out for her as wife or daughter or struggling white woman. Even though she tries really hard to change what people think about her gender, her role in society, or who she should report to as a human being, which actually does come up several times in the book, which is very concerning. To me, it seems that this book is about the failure of one person to have the life she wished to have, which is a life of freedom, living in the place that she enjoyed, and instead she gets locked up in an attic, which, as you can imagine, is not where most of us want to go. But at the same time, I still really empathized with Antoinette, and I really felt her struggle was valid and important, and that for me made this book more hopeful than depressing. And even though I can tell you now that this book doesn't have a happy ending, you're gonna want to find out how it ends. Now, on to the review. I love this book. I love this book. This book is probably one of my favorites that I've read since starting this reading challenge, and it's simply because this book is so short, yet it's packed so well with a lot of thoughtful prose, a plot that makes sense, and some really good criticism of things that were happening in Europe at the time. It's not just a deep and complex story, but it's also full of Easter eggs if you read Jane Eyre. It's kind of like when your favorite TV show does another season, but this time does it from the perspective of the antagonist or who you thought was the evil villain. But instead, that evil villain had an origin story because someone else was the real villain. And that is definitely the case with this book. And although I don't remember all the details of Jane Eyre perfectly, I feel like the wide Sargasso Sea encompassed very correctly the prison-like feeling that English society sort of had when reading parts of Jane Eyre. You could feel the oppression. You know, it's kind of like a little feeling in the air. One item that has to be mentioned is that blackness and race are a huge and vital, important part of this novel. There's an excellent article I read about this book, and I'd like to share a quote with you. The black Creoles are depicted as undifferentiated and unreasoning mass of people, physically alike and full of hatred. The black individual has no personal identity, no distinctive psyche. He is just a portion of a whole body of undifferentiatable people. The essentialist ideology is expressed through stereotypes. In this book, the whites consider themselves as the center and consequently think that they, the whites, know thoroughly the blacks, and that what the whites say about the blacks is unquestionably true. And one of the great examples I think is right at the start of the book, for me was crystal clear, was when two little girls want to play with each other. One is white Antoinette, and the other one is her friend from the village. Because of her upbringing, Antoinette, who starts very innocent and doesn't notice the differences between her and some of the other children, eventually starts to see the tensions that play out because her parents are a target of many of the black townspeople who, for good reason, really don't like them. I should also mention that there's some nasty uses of the N-word in this book, and so just look out for that if you find that troubling reading that in literature, like most novels of this time period. I think this book is so dense and so worth rereading because there's just so much in it and so many perspectives that you can take, and this book gives you a lot to think about. It's not only sort of educational in terms of the history, but it is also about the relationship between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester and the third woman that we don't know anything about really in Jane Eyre, but we now know a lot about in the wide Sargasso Sea. Also, I think this is a great educational introduction to the problems of race, gender, and power, and especially the history of the British colonial empire. I feel like I could talk about this book for so much longer, but instead of doing that, I'm going to encourage you to go read it because it's a very short book and a very easy read. Okay, well that's all for me this time around. I hope you liked this video. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any thoughts about this book, about some of the deep themes that we talked about today in the wide Sargasso Sea, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Next time we will be taking a dive into a very different kind of sea, this time going to the Greek islands in the Magus by John Fowles. And wow, it's going to be a trip, so I can't wait to discuss that one with you. That's all for me for now. Stay curious, stay reading.